channel. I'm Mark on RC74. In today's video I'm gonna give you a tutorial about the installation of the FPV gear I installed in my Multiplex Funracer. I go through all the steps I did during the installation, and at the end of the video I will also show you some footage of the first two flights. This kind of flying a plane was a totally new experience to me, so you will see in the flight footage that I wasn't really comfortable during the first flight. Also an issue about the CG. I will talk about the details about the CG later in this video. So let's jump into the steps for the build tutorial and have a closer look. First of all, I had to order a second canopy. This is the stock canopy which came with the kit, so I had to order a second one to install all the FPV gear, and I can also change back to the normal canopy without any FPV gear, just to flying line of sight, because it looks better and it's better in case of aerodynamics. First, I tried to do an installation with used FPV gear. I took a used Foxeer toothless micro camera and a Rush FPV Tank Ultimate Mini. But there were some issues because I crashed these components and they didn't really work trusty. I occasionally lost the live picture, and that was definitely too dangerous to fly with these components, so I decided to make a secure build, and finally I used the Runcam Phoenix and the AKK FX3 VTX, which has output power up to 600 milliwatts, which is definitely enough for flying an FPV plane like this. There is no long range flying, just having fun, doing some aerobatics and some low flying. That's the idea of this build. So these components really work fine for this FPV setup. To power up the FPV gear, I used a balancer cable, which actually is made for 4S batteries. In the Funracer I fly 3S 2200 milliamp batteries, but it's still no problem at all to connect the 3S battery balancer connector to the 4S connector of the FPV gear. So like this I was able to power up the FPV gear without installing any other cables inside the plane. For the FPV antenna I used a stubby antenna from Banggood, which does a good job for this build, and it also almost takes no place, so it fits perfectly into the canopy. The upcoming steps in the tutorial all show the first electronic setup, the old VTX I used and the Foxeer camera, which I later replaced with the Runcam and with the AKK VTX. But it doesn't matter, it's just about the steps I did, and you can see very well what really happened. So it doesn't matter if it's exactly the same camera or the exact same VTX, the installation stays the same. So the next step was to solder all the wires, to set up the electronics, to do a function check if everything works before I install all the components onto the canopy, because some of the components are glued onto the canopy and I didn't want to glue the stuff onto the canopy and then figure out that some components don't work. So that was the reason why I did the wiring before installation and did a function check. And I already saw an issue because the monitor was flickering, and this showed up that there is an issue with transmitting the live picture onto my goggles. I went to the airfield anyways and tried it, and I had really a total blackout, but luckily I didn't flew with the goggles on, so there was no issue, no crash. But you really have to check the FPV gear at flying field before you carry your goggles and want to fly FPV. To have the maximum field of view on this FPV setup, I checked the field of view of all the lens I have here laying around, and I figured out that an old GoPro replacement lens had the widest field of view, so I installed this one on the Foxeer camera, on the current Runcam. I don't have this GoPro lens installed. I did the test flights with the stock lens from Runcam. Did work pretty well, but I'm sure that I will change to the GoPro lens just to check the difference, if there is more comfortable feeling because of the wider field of view. During the installation there was a little surprise about the magnet, about the CANOPY magnet. It suddenly simply came loose and the magnet of the CANOPY stuck on the fuselage. So I recommend to check the CANOPY magnets on your Multiplex Funracer just to make sure to not lose the canopy during the flight, because this affects the flight characteristics massively. You even risk to crash your Funracer, so make sure that your magnets really fit well. So I glued the magnet back onto the canopy with some CA glue, and now the magnet can't come loose anymore. For power wiring, I recommend to make the power wire long enough just to make the handling easy. So when the battery is installed in the plane and you connect your cable of the FPV gear, you simply can keep the canopy beside your plane, and the cable is long enough to connect it to your balancer cable of your battery. So the installation and mounting of the canopy is pretty easy like this. To isolate all the solder spots, I used some plastic dip on really thin wires. This is a very easy way to cleanly isolate your cables, and no need for using shrink tube. That looks pretty clean, and it's also super easy to remove. Just heat your solder iron, put it directly onto the plastic dip, and the plastic dip melts and you can unsolder your solder points. Before I started the paint job, I did another installation check of the canopy, if the cover of the canopy fits perfectly onto the canopy itself, because I had to cut out all the area for the camera and the hole for the antenna. So I checked the fit and did another picture check if the whole FPV gear runs perfectly smooth. To cover the already installed components on the canopy, I used frog tape. This is a fantastic tape to do paint jobs, and I covered the antenna, the VTX and the camera just to protect the electronics from putting paint on it. Then I used the Multiplex Elapor paint to do the paint job. The biggest part is yellow in my case, and I used a little bit of silver paint just to make the canopy shape round again and not looking that cut it off if you keep it in yellow. Then it was time to remove the frog tape. Did a short check of the canopy if everything fits. Then I glued on the canopy cover onto the canopy. In this case I used liquid CA glue, and this wasn't the best solution because this liquid CA glue runs everywhere, and I had a little mess at the edge of the canopy, which I was able to clean more or less. But I would recommend to go for Uhupor, because Uhupor is also a strong glue and you can easily clean it up after it's cured. So it's really the easier way and the cleaner way to use Uhupor than CA glue in my opinion. On the Phoenix camera I removed the wires I don't use. I only use the power cables and the video signal, and all other wires I removed to have a cleaner build. For the first test flight, I didn't put on the goggles, I just turned them on and let the DVR recording run just to check after the flight if everything is clean on the DVR recording on the goggles, to make sure that I won't lose picture during the flight, to avoid crashing the plane. But everything went super smooth, the flight was perfect. The video was without interruptions of the live picture, so then I was ready to go for the first FPV flight. On the first FPV flight, the plane felt super bad. It was really unstable to fly, and the reason for this was that when I fly line of sight, I have the battery not centered on the battery mount, but a little bit more in front like this. You can see the white plastic plate here, and I put the battery in a position that it ends at the same spot on the rear end like the plastic plate. And for flying FPV, that felt really horrible. Line of sight was pretty good. You cannot do crazy aerobatics, but the plane feels good in the air. But for FPV, that was absolutely not possible to fly the plane safe. So for the second FPV flight, I really centered the battery onto the battery mount, and it was a massive difference between the first flight and the second flight with CG more in the back of the plane. The plane felt way more stable, more smooth, and I felt way more comfortable during the second test flight with CG more in the back than at the first flight. A nice surprise were the landings with the goggles on, so with the FPV view, with the pilot's view. I expected to have troubles to land the plane safely with the goggles on, but it was surprisingly easy to bring the plane safely down, and that was really fun. It was a cool experience, and I'm sure that I will fly the Funracer more in FPV setup than line of sight. So this is it about the installation tutorial of the FPV gear on the Multiplex Funracer. Now let's jump right into the raw footage of the two test flights. As already mentioned, the first test flight was really super bad, and you can see the shaky behavior of the plane in the air. I didn't feel comfortable at all, and you will see the difference between the first and the second flight. That the second flight was way better set up on the CG than the first flight. So this is it for today. Thanks for watching. I hope you liked the video. Have a good time. Happy flying. Bye bye.